Good evening. I am Dr. Lana Brodovich, Associate Professor of Political Science, and as of 15 minutes ago, officially the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights. I say 15. That was one of the events that Dr. He mentioned. The Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights was established in 2017 through the generosity of Shirley and Leonard Goldstein's children, Don Goldstein, Kathy Goldstein-Helm, and Gail Resnick. Thank you once again. The position was designed to foster engagement and collaboration on human rights, really by focusing on the faculty, by focusing on the students, and the community at large. As the newest community chair, I have a lot of work to do, and I have big shoes to fill because I'm following in the footsteps of Dr. Laura Alexander and Dr. Ramazan Kilic, who have done an amazing job in this role. But I'm ready to cultivate deeper understanding and engagement with human rights topics across our university, our city, and Nebraska, and even wider. One thing that I would like to mention now that Dr. He has mentioned that he's celebrating his 30 years, I am also celebrating 30 years in Nebraska. And one of the reasons why I have applied for this particular position is several years ago when Dr. Curtis Hutt started working on developing this Center for Human Rights. I had a great honor of meeting Shirley. And one of the things that we talked about is her work with refugees. I came 30 years ago as a refugee from Bosnia and Herzegovina, or former Yugoslavia at the time. And so 30 years ago, I definitely wouldn't be able to tell you that I would be standing here in front of you. But, and so Nebraska gives great chances to many people. And one of the things that I can just count sort of as one of my lucky stars is having met the Goldstein family, who has given us all of these fantastic opportunities to keep talking about human rights issues, to keep the memories of those who are suffering in places around the world, and to keep working on making their lives and our lives better. But let me move on and talk about our fantastic speaker tonight, Dr. Sam Moyn. And this is where I need glasses, I'm sorry. Professor Samuel Moyn is Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History and the head of Grace Hopper College at Yale University. Professor Moyn holds a doctorate in modern European history from the University of California-Berkeley and a law degree from Harvard University. He conducts research on a wide range of topics on political and legal thought, and including, and it's some of the stuff that he's working on and teaching on, is constitutional and international law. He's well known for his work on the historical, cultural, and legal development of the contemporary concept of human rights, including books such as The Last Utopia, Human Rights and History, Christian Human Rights, and Not Enough Human Rights in an Unequal World. Professor Moyn's most recent book discusses the history of liberal intellectuals during the Cold War. The lecture that you will hear this evening draws on his 2021 work, Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. In addition to his teaching and prolific research output, Professor Moyn is a public intellectual engaging with public writing and media. His work has appeared, and you probably have read it, in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, Boston Review, Chronicle of Higher Education, Guardian, London Review of Books, and many, many more. He also serves as a fellow for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And finally, Professor Moyn has made significant impact on the fields of law, history, and more through his intellectual leadership and editorial work. This includes his work as current co-editor of Journal of Humanity and previous co-editor of Modern Intellectual History, as well as his contributions to several book series, including the Brandeis Library of Modern Jewish Thought, the Cambridge University Press Human Rights and History series, and the University of Pennsylvania Press Intellectual History of the Modern Age series. He also serves on the editorial boards of Constellations, Global Intellectual History, the Historical Journal, the Journal of History of International Law, and Modern Judaism. I mean, who can compete with that? And what a great honor to welcome Dr. Moyn to this stage. So please, without further ado, Dr. Moyn.
Well, thank you to Laura, first of all, for the invitation, beautifully organized, to Lana for the introduction, to the Vice Chancellor, I guess above all to the Goldsteins, who make not just this lecture, but 25 years of lectures and an endowed chair for Lana and so many other activities possible. So in my time, I would like to just start a conversation about how today we've come to talk about war and think about war. We focus intently on whether we think it's being fought humanely enough. And I want to suggest that's new. And I want to ask you what the consequences are of this new way of engaging wars, our own or others. Now, since we're almost to the anniversary of October 7th, I think it's our responsibility to think about that particular war that's still raging in the Middle East. But I just want to hasten to start by saying I'm not going to tell you what I think about the rights and wrongs of the war, because I think what's most interesting is that everyone is engaging that war in new ways because of a big transformation in how we think we should talk about wars when we see them, when we hear about them, when we know people who suffer in them. So I began thinking about this topic when I was much younger. We all were in fall 2009. When Barack Obama, the then president, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. You might remember the call came in from Scandinavia. We all woke up that morning. Obama came down from the White House residence, and he had a new dog. His children were just teenagers, and Obama said they were helping him keep his now even bigger global superstardom in perspective. He said very interestingly that he didn't deserve the prize. He hadn't done anything yet. Now, as I'll say later, he actually had begun to transform the war on terror that he had inherited from his predecessor in really consequential ways. Then he went to Oslo in December, and he gave, I think, a morally extraordinary speech that, you know, if you ever want to think hard, you should read, because it's an astounding document. He went to receive a Nobel Peace Prize and defended war. He actually cited an American Christian theologian of the middle of the 20th century named Reinhold Niebuhr. Obama said this Christian had taught that we are sinful. War will never end. But Obama added that there is a saving grace, which is that it can be made less brutal by following the rules of war. And actually, Obama gave a shout out, an unprecedented one. No American president had ever done it, to the first co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, who was a Swiss Christian, very different kind of Christian, named Henri Dunant, who had called the European states together in the 1860s and asked them to begin to make war less brutal. Obama said, force is sometimes necessary. Wars are sometimes just. Americans will have to keep fighting sometimes. But unlike my predecessor, George W. Bush, I don't think the fact that my enemies are lawless means I can break the law. And so I will follow those rules that call on Americans to fight cleanly to kill fewer innocent people. And arguably, he took his own advice. Now, there was a fascinating speech 4 years later when Obama's real innovation in the war on terror, the armed drone program, had been revealed. He gave a speech at the National Defense University, and he wanted to explain that it would be fought following the same rules of war, keeping it from becoming brutal or too brutal. And he was heckled. Another morally, I think, staggering moment if you're interested in the wars our country fights for our sake and in our name. Because a protester, a Jewish one actually, named Medea Benjamin, heckled Obama. She works for an outfit called Code Pink, which is a peace organization. But interestingly, she said the trouble with Obama's drone war is that it was too brutal. The problem wasn't the war, but the way it was being fought, she said. Now, she was removed by the Secret Service. But Obama, a professor at heart, went off script, and he meditated on some of the limits of his own posture. And he said, maybe the trouble isn't that the war's too brutal, it's that endless war makes great countries decline. Maybe you think that was a prophetic moment. But regardless, the point of the speech was to lay out a commitment to fight a long war on terror, which in a sense shows no signs of ending even today, in conformity with the rules of law, making sure that it's not too brutal. Now, what I'll try to do in my short time is just give some background on where this whole idea came from. Who was Dunant? Is it a good thing necessarily to make war less brutal? And then I'll talk briefly about how things, I think, played out under Obama's watch, and then touch briefly the topic of the war in Israel-Palestine, really focusing much more on what Americans have thought about it, American statesmen and women, and how what happened under the war on terror and the debate about whether it was humane enough has affected the whole way that we have engaged this other war fought by our ally. And then I'll offer my own conclusions, but I said it's just a conversation starter. So when I say humanization, all I mean is that we can make violence less violent. And we might say it's crucial to do so. And the laws of war, which are age-old, were actually rebranded in the 1960s international humanitarian law to reflect a new purpose that some people thought all the rules that govern war should have, which is to inflict as little suffering as possible, only as much as necessary, especially when it comes to innocent civilians. Now, you don't have to think that there's such a thing as humane war. Isn't that an oxymoron? War is hell, an American once said. But even if that's true, there can be more humane war. And a lot is at stake in whether the promise by statesmen like Obama to make it more humane is just a lie, or whether actually war can be transformed, and what we should think about this promise. Well, interestingly, Dunant, who's pictured there on the left, the Swiss do-gooder, had an enemy in his time. It was Leo Tolstoy. And I want to talk about some questions he raised about the whole idea of making war less brutal, because I think we're getting some interesting answers in our time. As you know, Tolstoy was a novelist. I'm focusing on him more as just a different kind of Christian moralist than Dunant. And I want to focus first on some ideas he puts in the mouth of one of the two protagonists of War and Peace named Prince André or Andrew. Because right before the battle of Borodino, very famous in battle in the Napoleonic Wars, Prince Andrew says, I would not humanize wars if I were in charge. In fact, I would keep them brutal or make them more brutal. And he says, the idea of rules of war to reduce suffering is rubbish. And I think, based on the timing, he probably, Tolstoy, had Dunant's Swiss project in mind. Can't prove it, doesn't matter. Why did he think this? Well, mainly he thought that there's a risk in making war less brutal. At the time of War and Peace, Tolstoy thought we wouldn't focus on the reasons why we were fighting, and we would go to war when it's not worth it. And more than that, he claimed that brutal wars would either end more quickly or once they stopped, be less likely to start because they were so brutal. Now, I don't think that's all very sensible. And luckily, Tolstoy changed his mind in certain respects as he gave up novel writing after Anna Karenina and became a kind of Christian sage, his own very personal version of Christianity. And so I want to focus on how he developed his argument. The reason I think his first version of the argument isn't very credible is that we can think of brutal wars that go on a long time. And it's very hard to prove that a brutal war would keep another war from breaking out again. Doesn't seem like there's very strong evidence for that. So the later Tolstoy put his thinking in terms of risks. He said, what if there's a risk that comes when you humanize any violence? It's that you entrench violence. You make it harder to end as such. And I think we can, sympathize. It's not like a hard argument to make. I know you've had some statewide votes about whether to have the death penalty or not. Currently have it. But many death penalty activists are very open about the risks they court when they, instead of opposing the death penalty, they say, let's administer it more humanely, because then it becomes less controversial. And they openly deliberate about their strategies in view of this risk. It's not that you don't, when you can't get a big enough coalition together to end the thing, that you don't make it less brutal, but you think about it because there's a risk. And Tolstoy basically, in his maturity, raised these same concerns. And very interestingly, he raised some specific risks for different kinds of people. The first was about advocates, like human rights activists or humanitarian lawyers. He analogized these people working to make the war more humane to those, very real in this country, who had tried to make slavery more humane. Very big project before it was possible or credible to abolish slavery. And Tolstoy said, what if you gave slavery a new lease on life in reducing the suffering that masters were allowed to impose? In fact, he said it's worse because you're really making a deal with the slaver. You're saying, I'll help you entrench your property rights in humans by making it less controversial because there's less brutality involved. And then Tolstoy said, what if the same is true of war now? What about that risk? Don't we have to talk about it? And then he gave an example of a different actor. I'm going to call this not the advocate, but the beneficiary. And very interestingly, for the state of Nebraska, he used the example of the killing of or slaughter of non-human animals. Let me riff on this for a second because it's a statewide issue here. Tolstoy was living at the time of the invention of new, more humane slaughterhouses. And when he became a serious Christian, he gave up eating meat. He became a pacifist and really the world's most famous vegetarian, had a huge influence in that respect on people like Mohandas Gandhi, who was a Tolstoyan. And Tolstoy visited a slaughterhouse near him and wrote about it in a kind of impressive text in early animal ethics. And he said, here's what I'm worried about, what I'm going to call the beneficiary's bad faith. He said, if the killing is more humane, you'll eat the meat and think you're still a good person. And actually, I think there's some evidence that this is a genuine concern. About a decade ago, a Yale grad student named Timothy Pachirat came here and posed as a migrant worker and wrote a book about the slaughterhouse. You know, the one or two really big ones are in this state that exist in this country. And he said, there's some similarities to drone warfare. Now, this is far-fetched, but let me explain what he said. He said, drone warfare works through distance, like you don't see it. He says at the slaughterhouse, though there's a kill floor, there are walls. So almost no one sees the animals being put to death, even the local workers. And Pachirat said, the point is to kind of immunize us so that something is done in our name or for our sakes, killing, but we don't know it. Now, there's something else in his ethnography that I want to focus on because it fits this argument about humanizing violence. Pachirat doesn't reflect on it, but he shows that in the little space where the animals are killed, the Food and Drug Administration has monitors who can come look to make sure that the workers aren't being too brutal. Why? No one's seeing it. The reason is obviously that someone cares to pass a law requiring that the violence, in this case, inflicted on non-human animals for our sake, in our name, is not done too violently. Why? Tolstoy's point was, it makes us feel like good people to know that. And if that's true, what are the implications for war? Why does it work when a politician like Obama stands before us and says, I'm not Bush. My war for you, necessary and just though it is in its cause, will be done humanely. And that makes you good people. Now, maybe it does. I mean, we could stop eating meat. Maybe we can't stop fighting wars. And if we can't, maybe it is good. We're good. If then the violence is minimized, especially for innocence. But maybe we don't have to have every war. And then what's the function of this humanizing effect? Well, to help us fool ourselves morally. That was Tolstoy's challenge. Now, I think he was way early to make these challenges. Interestingly, Dunant's successor at the Swiss Red Cross said, no, actually, it's the reverse. The more we make war humane, the more peace will come. It's like a foot in the door. If you think someone you're shooting at across the battlefield is a person, and there are limits on mistreating him, then how can you not take the next step someday and make peace with him? It's like a slippery slope. Now, this, I think, turned out to be wrong. And so I think if that's true, we have to stick with Tolstoy and at least ask whether it could ever happen that humanizing violence, as death penalty advocates know, could entrench violence. Now, this same man named Gustave Moynier, Dunant's successor, actually said at one amazing moment, if this turned out to be true, if Tolstoy was right, I would shut down the Red Cross. I would stop passing these laws of war. If it could happen that the law could function to make war seem harmless to people so that it was easy for them to perpetuate it, I would turn in my badge as a humanitarian and become a pacifist. Now, he never did that. The reason was that wars were just so brutal, and I'll just mention why so we can get to our present. The first reason is most of the laws of war weren't like the original Geneva Convention of 1864. They said militaries can do anything they need to do, wanton killing. So if there's no humane war, there's no risk. Second, this set of rules was really for Christian on Christian, white on white violence across the Atlantic. We know that in these same decades, these same Christian Europeans were expanding empire to the ends of the earth and fighting the most pitilessly brutal wars against non-Christians and non-whites, to which no rules applied. But again, if that's true, then there's no problem. There might be a big problem morally, but there's no problem with the rules of war and the effects they could have in perpetuating war. Finally, even in warfare in the global north, like World War I, when push came to shove, white Christians just dropped the rules. Great examples would be World War I, World War II, horrendous, no holds barred. Interestingly, H.G. Wells, that early, in between World War I and II, said these rules of war that claim to be able to reduce suffering in war are what he calls a sop to humanity. They're a palliative that is leading people to embrace war rather than ending it. I think that was too early, but that's me. What I think happened is that finally the rules changed. And it wasn't even after World War II, with the newest Geneva Convention, still good today, which come to us from 1949. Because whatever you think about the ethics of our Korean War, our Vietnam War, these were not fought humanely. Watch any film, read any book. What I think happened is that after that, there were some what seemed like modest amendments to the rules of war. They have this ungainly title, the Additional Protocols to the Geneva Conventions. They're from 1977. And they changed the rules, mainly in two big respects. First, they finally said you cannot shoot at a civilian. Astounding that that's the first time that rule was propounded. It has major implications. Second, there's a new rule of proportionality, which is central to how people are debating the war in the Middle East, which says even when you shoot at combatants, you can kill civilians, but not too many. These two rules revolutionized, at least potentially, the practice of warfare. Just as an example, the kind of so-called morale or strategic bombing widely practiced in the middle of the 20th century, including in our Pacific War and in our other Pacific wars of Korea and Vietnam, they're just not possible. And the potentially millions of civilian death that came with those practices come to an end. That doesn't mean war is humane, but it does open up new possibilities because the content of the rules is different. I think that was possible mainly because of decolonization. Like the victims of all the imperial war of centuries now had a seat at the table, and they said, we want peace, but if we can't have it, we'd like more humane war. And they got it, at least on paper. Further, the old imperialists, the Europeans, gave up their empires. No more wars to fight. They left Americans that responsibility. Convenient. And they all became Swiss. So all Europeans have a moral high ground, largely in virtue of not being imperialists anymore. And they embrace these new rules. Even the military did in this country, which is an amazing story because after Vietnam, I think there was a public relations crisis, but also a lot of soldiers felt their moral honor was at stake in what was revealed about American wartime conduct in Vietnam. And a lot of lawyers got involved and insisted that American troops start to follow the new rules. And big things happen. By the end of the story, in our day, lawyers are deeply involved in choosing targets, which is an absolutely extraordinary novelty in the history of military affairs. It's also happening in the Israeli military today. Now, if you have a drone strike to conduct, you have to get the lawyers to sign off. Totally unprecedented. And of course, the laws against which they're checking your proposed strike are the rules of distinction and proportionality to make sure you're not shooting at civilians, or if some are going to be killed, alas, it's not too many. And the Gulf War, I think the first Gulf War we thought was pretty important in this regard because it's the first war in which you had new cause groups like Human Rights Watch monitoring whether both sides in the Gulf War were complying with the new rules of war, even as lawyers, for the first time in the American military, were helping pick targets. Well, that set the stage for what happened after 9/11. Most of people work with the narrative of September 11th that it unleashed inhumanity, for sure, but it did so against a new set of expectations historically, that inhumanity was wrong. Those expectations hadn't prevailed at the time of Korea or Vietnam. Now they did. And that's why Bush got in trouble, at least with the people who felt that his detention and torture programs were beyond the pale. And something interesting happened, which is that he began to move towards humane war himself. But of course, it was Obama who completed the job. When he went on the stage in Oslo, he said, I am going to fight a new form of war that is torture-free. That's what makes my just war legitimate. But in making that claim, he was given room for maneuver. Where George Bush, for all his faults, had fought a geographically restricted war in largely two countries, and actually began to withdraw from one of them, Obama expanded the war geographically to 13 countries of active fighting and killing by Americans. And many people began to talk during Obama's time about endless war as something that the war on terror had become. There was also a turn kind of strategically to new tools. I mentioned drones, which became a kind of worldwide enterprise, and also special forces. Light footprint rather than no footprint war became very central to the way the war on terror came to be prosecuted. And good or ill, I just want to insist that what's interesting for the purposes of today about this change in the war is the way that Obama talked about it, which is that it was more humane. Not everyone agreed, but where the reformers basically bickered with the military and negotiated with them, like the humanitarian reformers under slavery, about whether the violence was humane enough yet, Obama invited the beneficiaries, just like the beneficiaries of non-human animal slaughter, to think they were okay now. They were on high ground morally because of the new attention to the rules that Obama introduced. So that's the moment, I think, when Tolstoy's warnings, which were so long premature, became worth thinking about seriously. Now, there are no clear answers. Just to be clear with you and honest, maybe there are some just wars that have to be fought. Maybe in that circumstance, the most important thing is to fight humanely. But what about these risks? Do we figure out how to manage those? How to make sure that we're not running afoul of these dynamics that reformers could help bake in evil, that they could oppose, that beneficiaries don't think they're good people if the wars aren't worth fighting, just because their politicians are telling them that the results are humane. Okay, well, I'll just end with a few reflections on the way the debate around Israel's response to October 7th has gone down, and invite you to tell me what you think. I don't think there's any doubt that what Hamas did was brutal. It has been denounced as a war crime, and the leaders of Hamas have been indicted. They weren't trying to be humane. They do not have lawyers. Israel does. And like America, it has been trying to insist that it is following the rules. Right at the beginning of the war, America, Israel's crucial ally and arms provider, had its leaders explain what was morally at stake. And it was very interesting that Biden suggested that this same kind of rhetoric that Obama had pioneered around the war on terror applied again. He said, we will make sure that this war is kept clean, because that's how we will know that it is okay for us to fund and arm. Meanwhile, Israelis complained that their lawyers were not being taken seriously enough. They were trying to do what Obama had said civilized states should do. They have lawyers. Every strike is approved by lawyers. The lawyers, among many other things, do proportionality calculus for every attack. They say, what is the expected military advantage that will be gained? How many will die if among the innocent? And then they'd sign off or not. And they said, why did it work for Obama and not for us? And I think it's actually a really interesting question. Why the promise of humanization of war that Obama pioneered as a kind of legitimating strategy has fallen on very different ears in the global public, on university campuses, I don't know if this one, but mine and others today. I think it's a really good question, which we could talk about. What I'm interested in is the way in which both sides in this horrendous struggle have been living in this new moral world of humane war. The Israelis might express some frustration about why their, at least from their perspective, law-abiding war is not being credited as morally upright. How do advocates of the Palestinian self-determination struggle respond? Actually, they don't talk that much about Palestinian nationalism or self-determination, or what remedy, one state, two state, they would find just and credible. They say the war is brutal. That's the problem with it. They take cases or have cases taken by others to international fora, courts especially, that aren't adjudicating the rights and wrongs of the war except when it comes to its conduct. Is it genocide, isn't it? Which war crimes were committed? As if you removed those, the excess, and endless war would be what we want. And yet, in fairness, Obama set those expectations along with everyone else, the Swiss originally, who brought us into this new world of debating war based on this singular question of whether it is humane. Now, it's interesting because I think this is blinkered. And again, whichever side of the conflict in Israel-Palestine you sympathize with. One reason is that it leads to, I think, very unfortunate advice that our country then gives out. Take Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, who said, whatever is right and wrong in war, if you're too brutal, you will lose the war of public opinion. Follow the rules of war so that you're seen as moral. Maybe that, in fairness, that's what a military officer, former, should say, thinking about strategy. But presumably, we should care about how war is fought, in a sense, for its own sake, not because it looks good to fight it cleanly. More important, we should be asking, what are the rights and wrongs of the war? How can the war end? What are the conditions for a political solution? If all that's true, and this is where I'll conclude and really want to hear from you, I wonder, for all the importance of reducing violence where it's necessary or just going to happen, whether it also leads us astray because we end up having the wrong argument. What would be a kind of world in which terrorism isn't an appealing political strategy? What would be the kind of world in which two peoples on the same land can live in it together? And those questions get indefinitely postponed. Instead, what we have are endless wars where all we talk about is whether they're too brutal, and if so, how we could push the parties to be more humane. That's scary, I think, because in the end, what should matter is not whether there's less suffering, but more peace, and yet we've lost our ability to pursue that end. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sam. Thanks for those thought-provoking remarks. And we do have some time here for questions and answers. I and my colleague John Leyden are going to have some mics here. So in order to make sure that everything is heard for both audiences, yeah, there's one up here, John, thanks. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring this out and hold the mic for you. We do ask maybe that questions could stay to about a minute long, just because hopefully we'll have several questions. And if there's anyone watching online who would like to put a question in the Q&A, we will also try to take as many of those as we can. The only thing I'll say to you guys is probably best if we keep these mics off unless they're actually being used, just to avoid too much interference with the mics. So I will open it up.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. It was a really wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it, Dr. Moyn. My question is, basically, you talked about the drone wars and the lawyers being involved in when Israel, or maybe even if Americans were like conducting those drone attacks around the world or anywhere in the part of the world. So my question is, those lawyers, I mean, what and how do these countries or these parties ensure the credibility of those lawyers? And if those lawyers are making those decisions upon which like an attack is being conducted, I mean, what is the source of information that those lawyers are being provided with? Probably it is coming from the intelligence here, right? So the intelligence, wouldn't that be like pretty much biased when it comes to those attacks? And another thing that you talked about, the long wars. So this might like sound a bit silly question, but I was considering, what is your time frame of those long wars? Like, what do you see a long war, like how long should it be to be called a long war? Okay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I think those are both really interesting questions. You know, I don't have a good answer to the second question because I don't know. I mean, a lot depends on our expectations, but you know, if you think about it, the 20-year war in Afghanistan was exceptionally long by American historical standards. I mean, relative to Vietnam and Korea, if you use those comparisons, even World War II or World War I, Americans were involved for 2 years barely. So it's totally fair to say, oh well, maybe we should consider 20 years a short war relative to the 100 years war of the early modern period. Everything's relative, but I would say, you know, a multi-generational war is long. And what's very important about the war on terror, to my mind, is that the legal authorities, even after Joe Biden withdrew from Afghanistan to conduct a kind of borderless war on terror, have never been relinquished. And so, the next president, whoever he or she is inheriting an endless war kind of in the making that could be reactivated. And it's very important that Joe Biden, in withdrawing from Afghanistan, very explicitly reserved the right to conduct what he called over-the-horizon wars, which are wars that are basically, conducted using drones and special forces. More than that, I skipped this for time, but in his first campaign, Donald Trump, presented himself as the real anti-war candidate. He said, falsely on the debate stage in South Carolina in 2016 that he had opposed the Iraq War and actually gained a lot of traction among Republican voters for doing so. That was kind of unprecedented. But then, in the campaign against Hillary Clinton, he kind of said, she's the warmonger, I'm against endless war. So if it was endless enough for Trump, same for me. Now, your first question is a really good question. And it's really important to say there is another rule in the laws of war today, which is called the rule of precaution. Because if states and militaries were incentivized to, in a sense, not to know what they're doing so that they wouldn't know that they're breaking the rules about shooting at civilians and not killing too many, then we would have states kind of intentionally avoiding, very good knowledge of what they were shooting at. And so they're not allowed to. But as you say, all there is self-restraint. And that's a big problem with international law in general, not just this one domain, where states police themselves and punish their own outside very exceptional circumstances. And what that means is that, of course, we can ask a lot of critical questions and say, well, wait, how are the lawyers interpreting the rules? Since lawyers serve clients, and when they serve their own states, they interpret the rules permissively. A lot of people think that's the problem, and they say war should be more humane because lawyers should interpret the rules more restrictively, and they don't. It's a fair point. I just would respond, it's amazing that they're there to begin with. What does it tell us about war and about us that we want them there in the same way we want the FDA on the kill floor here? And of course, as you say, we also need a system to incentivize better knowledge. You may be heartened to hear that the Department of Defense, in response to certain criticisms of the war on ISIS, has set up something called the Center of Excellence for Civilian Casualties at the Pentagon. And it's doing what you suggest is the problem. It's kind of trying to solve it by making commanders know more, check even more carefully, making sure the lawyers understand the rules a little bit more restrictively. And I think that's all noble. But I guess my worry is that it's part of the humane war project. And what if that project, has these risks we need to confront, not just push the project further and further?
Wow, that's a lot to think about. I find myself wanting more nuance, that there must surely be a distinction between the level of brutality against combatants. I was just at the World War I Museum in Kansas City. The gas used in World War I, just horrific after effects. The level of brutality against innocents, the level of brutality against infrastructure, land, the things that allow a people to continue after. And I think I heard in your remarks a lot of interest in numbers of casualties. But there are things that don't kill people. Rape doesn't kill people. Taking away livelihood doesn't kill people. Depriving people of future education. And so I'm wondering where the academic discipline goes that's a little more nuanced, that slices this up.
It's a great point. This talk was, just because of the nature of the public debate under the War on Terror, was focused on civilians. It's absolutely true that many of the rules of war are about either combatants and limits on how they can be treated, especially in detention, but also infrastructure from which civilians benefit. And that's all very germane. One of the main troubles has been that both America and Israel have made the claim, highly disputed, that current war is characterized by dual-use targets, and that the very attempt to humanize war leads those who are lawless and unscrupulous to take advantage of the rules. Now, that happens in the case of the excess civilian death I focused on. in the case of practices of so-called human shielding. But on the material you talked about, hospitals, schools, infrastructure generally, of course, like you can hide weapons in a hospital, and then there's going to be a big debate about what to do about so-called dual-use targets. So all of this is part of this general project. I think most people think the lives of the civilian innocents is at the moral core. So that's why I focused on it. But of course, you're totally right that really the soldiers matter too. I mean, I think it's actually kind of astounding that we live in a world in which it's fair game to kill a combatant at any time, in any number, at least within these rules. When many of those combatants are being considered combatants by the targeting states based on their gender and age, not because of any conduct they've engaged in, and certainly they're not wearing uniforms. And so that's something that the laws of war, I think, are in a sense, are failing to be humane enough with respect to people we should care about too, soldiers. Some of whom are fanatical and ideological, but others just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then there's the Dresden level destruction of infrastructure, which we might think is intolerable, notwithstanding however many innocent civilians die. I just focused on that because I think the actual lives of innocent people, especially women and children, is at the core of the discourse about war, even more than these like related domains. But you're completely right that a full account would have to focus on all the rules and like whether there should be more and which matter most and which are being violated. With all due respect, maybe I would say even once we pan out in the more nuanced way you suggest, we're in the same debate. Are these rules prettifying war? Or are they prettifying them enough that we should control the risks that we're not focusing on the war and just on the prettification of it?
There's this aphorism that goes, the purpose of a system is what it does. Do you think there's any major social purpose to these forever wars, especially given, in my opinion, the lack of an overarching strategy of the war on terror? And then my second question is, do you foresee any future forever wars taking place?
Both amazing questions. I'm clearly motivated by my perception that at least large elements of the war on terror, and frankly, almost all American wars in my lifetime, have made the world worse. And that's why I'm wondering, well, how did they not just last so long, but kind of how did they come to seem legitimate? And that's why I'm focused on the claim that humanizing them makes them tolerable to some very important people. And we know that matters because Obama's two main speeches on his war were about this transformation, boasting about it. And then when we look at other wars, we find this same concern. Now, I am not a pacifist, although I think it's very significant that peace movements in American history have largely collapsed, very prominent in the early 20th century, and then at the time of the Vietnam War, not so prominent later. I think that there might be some just wars to fight, and then we would want them to be fought humanely. But what about all the unjust ones? Okay, on your second question, I assume that these wars have not ended. I mean, there's a certain way of looking at the war on terror, as I already said, that in a sense says it's not over. I think there's a way of looking at the current struggle in Palestine, which is in a new phase, as part of a very long war. And so how do we get the right kind of chronological perspective and think about outbursts of violence as part of long patterns? And I think, the risk that Israelis feel of harm and the subjugation that Palestinians in the West Bank feel under occupation, and I'm not even going to get into the legal status of Gaza. All that's been going on for years or decades. So there's a frozen struggle, and this is a bloody phase of it. But I think what that means is that I don't think we have to look into the future for endless war. It's going on, and then the question is, why are we not seeing more like peace movements and only humanization movements? And is the balance off? That's the only question I'm humbly posing.
Since World War II and the creation of the UN, and we've had all these wars, why do we have the UN, and what's their purpose?
That's a great question, and I do focus a lot on that in the book, because you could compare the law around how war is fought just with like morality or peace as a moral ideal. But the truth is the UN Charter is a body of peace law. It says nothing about how wars should be fought. It's all about not having them. And yet, it broke down. It didn't break down in Korea. You may know this story that when the United States wanted to go to the aid of South Korea, it went to the United Nations Security Council. And fortunately, the Soviet representative was on a holiday on Long Island and couldn't veto the resolution. And so America's intervention there was legal under international law. That was not true of Vietnam, deadlocked because the UN Security Council was deadlocked for decades. And most of the wars that have broken out have not been dealt with by the United Nations because of great power politics, with very limited exceptions. So the question is, do we give up on an international law and organization that's going to be about not having wars and just focus on keeping them clean, or do we try harder? And there are arguments about how to reform the Security Council. There are arguments about adding the crime of aggression to international criminal processes, like the International Criminal Court. At Nuremberg, as you may have read, in 1945-6, the chief crime the Nazis were accused of was warmongering, aggressive war. And no one's been held to account since they and the Japanese were for that crime. So maybe we can kind of pick ourselves up, since history is long, and go back and figure out how to have politics and law focus on peace primarily, since war is the gateway to a lot of bad things, many of them legal, the death of soldiers, the death of some civilians legally, all the opportunity cost, guns rather than butter, all of the unintended consequences. Many more people died in Iraq, not because Americans or their allies shot at them, but because they invaded and caused chaos. And we need to stop wars from happening, first and foremost. So no, the UN is broken, but then we, as with any broken thing, you either fix it or give up. And so let's do the first.
We have several questions online as well, and I know we have some out here, so we will do the best we can. Is it all right, John, if I take this one online?
Oh, yeah.
So go ahead, Angela, if you don't mind just reading it out.
Sure. When dealing with the long war on terror, how are the secular nations to humanely handle situations where state-based terrorist organizations see inhumane conduct or martyrdom as a proper means to achieve their goal based on their convictions?
Okay, it seemed like the premise of the question is that this country is a secular nation, which is a relief. I think, this was Obama's point, I think a very good one, that irrespective of the way the other state, the other party in a struggle is fighting, you're not absolved from illegality. Like, you can't break the rules because your enemy is doing so, especially in an asymmetrical war. Israel doesn't claim to do so. It's very important. We can say, they have lawyers misreading the law, or they don't have adequate information, or whatever you may think. But what is in a way very important is that we're beyond a time when I think great powers could get away with saying, well, the savages are fighting savagely, so we can't be civilized. I think it's actually quite important that that's seen as an unavailable move. And then we've got these residual problems that, maybe we think humane war isn't very humane, or it leads to more war. But I personally think it would be sad if we went back to an era, which was, I think, intolerable, of saying that the way others are fighting us means we can stoop to their level.
Hi, just maybe it's a little bit of pushback on the claim
Please, yeah.
that that Israeli lawyers are signing off on all the strikes. I know a couple that have been working in this area, and I also know about AI and the use of AI in determining those targets.
Sure.
And can't imagine that there are lawyers signing off on, how many strikes have occurred in Lebanon just in like the last 2 days, that these are going to Israeli lawyers, and Israeli lawyers are signing off on that. So I'm wondering what you would say about the future, right, of given the fact that AI is developing and being used by Israelis in things like drone swarms as well. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that question. And I closed the book I'm talking about now with the rise of autonomous weapon systems. AI in 2021 was not in the headlines in the same way, but there's been already a very big debate for 15 years about the consequences after drones of taking pilots out of the system. You're totally on firm ground in saying that to an extent, it's a very different world when lawyers are consulted about the algorithm, but not about the strikes to which the algorithm leads. Now, some would say that's huge progress, that they have a role in telling the machines what to do at all, which again, relative to the first Lebanon war or, Korea, like winter of 1950, wouldn't want to be there. But you're, of course, right that algorithmic war, I think, raises the prospect of a very scary future. Drone swarms, too. I guess, I would love to hear, from you or others, like how that changes the analysis exactly, because many people have said, well, we just need to program the machines more humanely. Like the algorithm should be more humane than it is now. The lawyers should push the programmers harder. To their credit, some of the humanitarians who I kind of indicted as in a sense, collaborating with militaries, even while bickering with them, have founded an abolitionist campaign. So go on the web to stoptheslaughterbotts.com. And this is a project driven by Human Rights Watch, which used to say, let's bicker with military lawyers about picking targets, and move to the stance that there should not be autonomous weapons systems at all in war. They're losing that struggle. But regardless, we're back to this basic dilemma. Do we focus on war itself and its prosecution, or do we say, pretty please, lawyers do better, statesmen conduct it more humanely? And I'm just suggesting that we've gotten the balance wrong, and it would be the same answer, notwithstanding these new technological developments.
Sam, do you mind if we take 2 or 3 questions here and
Oh.
see how we do?
Sure.
Do you mind, John?
I guess my question, and I'm sorry if I haven't formulated it entirely in my head.
That's cool.
But I'm kind of curious because I feel like it's so, it's kind of shocking when you hear maybe, or at least to me, the Obama reference as sort of like, if even Obama did it, sort of is how I'm kind of framing the thing.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious if how many Black people you spoke to calculate that framing, or if there's any kind of grace that you've calculated into that framing of Obama's decision-making as the first Black president of America, and maybe how he had to make those kind of calculations in his choices, like as a president who couldn't wear like a tan suit without it becoming like a national scandal, or his wife couldn't wear sleeveless photograph. Like if you've calculated any of that into your calculation of how he made choices as president, or if you're ranking him or the choices that he made as like a George Bush or all the other previous white male presidents in our country, if you've given or calculated any kind of grace into his limitations, even as president of the United States, that he had to, of how he had to operate, if that's included in your analysis of his choices.
I'll take one more over here. Sorry, Sam. Yeah, I'll take
Do you
one
want me
more
to answer that one, or yeah?
So during the original, phases of the war on terror, I would say at least up until Trump's inauguration, Bush and Obama both made a real effort to frame the war on terror as sort of a ideological war.
Yes.
Bush would say, a crusade, infamously, and then Obama would talk about, the importance of emphasizing democracy or spreading democracy. But what I was wondering is, do you expect that if there's a push, and if there is, only if there is a push to follow international law and rules of proportionality, that will mean more or less ideological wars and more or less, conflicts of interest and, wars of greed and grievance? Because there's also an argument to be made that it'll, reduce ideological wars if you can't just go to war over, I feel differently about this than you. So which way do you see that going in the future?
Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, so in order, these are both fantastic questions. I have the highest regard for Barack Obama. I give him way more than grace. I think he's the best president I've seen in my lifetime. And in particular, because he was so morally honest. And he would come out, and he wasn't, just a rhetorical president, though he was brilliantly gifted as a speaker. But he wrote his speeches. He really cared about saying what he believed. And when he was morally uncertain, he called himself out. That was what I think was so arresting about the 2013 National Defense University address, is that he said, I may have erred. And what president goes that far in the face of a heckler? And he is someone I think we're properly nostalgic for. that doesn't mean that he was perfect. And I don't really even, in a sense, call him on the moral choices that I reviewed, but it's more like, what are we all doing? Because the point of Tolstoy's example of the slaughterhouse isn't, about those migrant workers killing the animals. It's that we think, all the people eating them, that we're okay because something is being done more humanely for us. So this is a critique of us. He's just us. And it's about how our moral expectations have changed. And, he would famously say, like, if you want the world to be different, make me make it different. And so I worry that we did. And we made the wars that he fought for us more humane because we wanted it that way. It's not even about him, because he was great. On this question, I failed to mention that, it's really interesting to look at how Trump inherited the war on terror. And in a sense, he's a much more realist president than the ideologues, if you want to call them that, who preceded him. What I think is fascinating in this story is that he retained Obama's rules, basically. Obama's rules at that 2013 speech called the Presidential Policy Guidance were amazing, because I mentioned that the rule of proportionality says that all you have to do is check that the military advantage of a strike outweighs the civilian injury, death or injury. Obama said, no, if there's going to be any civilian harm from a strike, we won't conduct it. Now, of course, that wasn't true. There were strikes in which there was civilian death. But what's amazing is that Obama went beyond what the law required and said, I am not going to risk any civilian harm. And Trump kept that rule. So to me, like, this new syndrome, if you want to call it that, is almost like it's independent of the ends of war. And even when there are big changes at the top, there's a lot of pressure to keep war humane, whether there are like realist strikes or ideological wars declared for democracy or freedom. I don't know if that gets at your question exactly, but obviously Americans right now in this state with your, electoral voting system and blue dots and whatnot have like there's a very big choice going on here about what kind of foreign policy president to have. My suggestion is that neither one is going to fundamentally challenge the coming of humane war. Harris, because I think she'll follow Obama, and Trump, because he accepted Obama's rules the first time around, by and large.
I think we may have to end it there. I know we do have some other questions, and I apologize for those of you to whom we were not able to get your questions. I hope, as Sam said, this was intended to spark conversation. I hope that means that we can continue to have these conversations. And again, I just want to thank Professor Sam Moyn so much for your talk tonight and all of you for coming. Thank you, Sam.